House and Senate.
So how long has the DCCC been in the business of intervening in primaries, or is it something that is sort of ad hoc, depending on the year, depending on their resources?
It's more ad hoc because, like you said, oftentimes their bigger challenge was just finding a good candidate.
Right.
Recruiting somebody who was going to run a credible, well-financed and potentially winnable race. It's unusual for them to have situations where there are so many candidates who just objectively all have a credible chance of winning. And so in general their response to that has been odd. It's been to say, okay, well then this is our person, and oftentimes they're siding with people who had run in the past, who they know after the party has spent so much airtime encouraging new people to get in. But it's something that has precedent, and there's a logic behind it. If you are a party and you feel like there is somebody running who could embarrass the party in the general election but might be able to squeak through a primary, and they're going to get routed by the Republican, if that's your sincere belief, then there's a reason. There's a reason for you to go in and endorse. And the second reason would be if you think that the challengers aren't serious, that there's no way that these challengers ever are going to win the primary anyway, then you just go ahead and go in and say, look, we need to endorse this candidate X because she's going to win the primary and she's going to be the general election candidate, so we can't wait around until June or August to start helping her, because our goal is to beat the Republican in November. And so I think in some of the cases, the party just misunderstood the field and thought that some of these people weren't really going to have serious challengers. And so they weren't intentionally trying to pick a fight with a credible challenger. It's just they didn't, their vision didn't include them. In other cases, they just have candidates that they prefer for a variety of reasons.
All right. So in the first instance, you don't want, from the perspective of the party, and this is also, there's an assumption here too that I want to question in a moment. But in the first instance, you don't want a Christine O'Donnell situation where your candidate, and she was in a Senate race, but your candidate's platform is I'm not a witch, and you don't want that person to be the candidate. In the second instance, it's basic resource conservation, right? Like, we have a limited amount of resources. We got a good candidate. Let's try and drive everybody out of the primary, so there isn't a primary that's going to suck any resources out. And we should say that because this is not a problem that the DCCC has faced a lot in its history, there's probably not a lot of institutional expertise at intervening on the primary level. And with that said, let me also just but add that the way they intervene on the primary level is probably also indicative of the way that they intervene on the general election level. So that tells us something there. I want to just also table the assumption that the DCCC is functioning. And it's the same assumption, I think, that people make this mistake when you look at, like, corporations. Like, there's this presumption that people in a corporation are acting in the best interests of a corporation, or know what that is, as opposed to acting in their own best interests. And I want to circle back to that. But let's talk about a specific example in Minnesota. Angie Craig versus Jeff Erdemann. This is happening now. Tell us about that race.
Right, and the primary is sort of starting today. Minnesota has a very complicated 3-step primary process. It involves getting delegates involved in caucuses, and then this, and so it begins now. But the race is an interesting one. In 2016, the party got behind a candidate named Angie Craig, who's an executive at a medical device company in Minnesota, who moved to that district fairly recently. She raised something like $5 million in 2016, which the DCCC celebrates that. Like that's a huge amount of money to raise in a race like that. It goes towards consultants who help run that race, and then millions of dollars on TV ads to pummel the Republican in the hopes of winning. She ended up underperforming everybody on the ballot. She did worse than Hillary Clinton. She did worse than the state house candidates in that district. She did worse than the state Senate candidates in that district. There was a third party, Independence Party candidate who peeled off about 30,000 votes, which would have been the difference if somehow she managed to win every single one of those. And so it was a well-run race from the perspective of Washington. Raised the right amount of money, ran the right kind of ads, ran the right kind of campaign, but it performed badly. So she's running again in 2018, and this time a guy who had volunteered on her campaign, who's a football coach and a American government teacher in Minnesota, lived in Minnesota his whole life, decided to run. He was one of these people who was inspired by the Women's March and the energy against Trump to finally say, you know what, I'm gonna get off the sidelines. But the difference is huge. Craig has millions of dollars at her fingertips to run the campaign. Erdman, he went down to 80% time as a teacher so he could keep health insurance but have time to run. His wife took on a second job, so they could get by with his reduced income, and he just has not been able to raise the money. So this is one of those cases where, in some of the cases around the country, the progressive candidate did manage to outraise the kind of party-backed candidate. In this case, he never caught on. And part of it is that there are so many of these candidates around the country that the small dollar groups who are looking to help them, almost can't keep up.
Right.
There's just too much to do. And
so when we say small,
when
we say small dollar groups, we're talking like Justice Democrats or People's House Project or ad hoc Our Revolution, or ad hoc groups in Brooklyn. Et cetera, et cetera. So,
right.
But wait, let me just ask this about Angie Craig. Through your reporting, you have $5 million. You underperform everyone on the ballot. How is that possible? Like, how bad of a candidate do you have to be? I'm not saying that facetiously. Like, that's pretty.
Yeah.
And there's two things that pop out for me. One is, how bad of a candidate do you have to be? Two, like, how much medical devices are coming out of Minnesota? Because I know that was one of the things that Franken was really bad on too, was trying to get that tax repealed. So a lot. Okay, so
that's the industry there. That's like their big industry.
Well, how bad of a candidate do you have to be? Like, what was she doing that was turning off so many voters? Because clearly she was able to get her message out. It was just that, like, her message or her was rejected, like, solidly.
Well, so she ran the kind of party playbook strategy, which is, you run against bad things, like you're against bigotry, you're against racism. She's lesbian, so she's for LGBT rights. So she's pro-choice, but you don't really talk much about Wall Street. You don't talk about Medicare for all. You're not saying you're going to do free public college. You just kind of are for good things and against bad things. And that may have helped create the opening for this third party candidate to pick up the X number of votes. It didn't inspire kind of a grassroots army to go out and say we should be supporting this person. And people don't talk much about Minnesota because Clinton ended up winning it, but it was razor thin. It was 10,000 votes or so,
right.
And it almost fell to Trump. So this was not a good year for Democrats in Minnesota, even though she ended up eking it out in the end.
So the DCCC comes in and they're just like, yes. What's the theory? If we raise even more money, she'll be better this time, or she's learned a lesson, or what?
Well, I actually think there's a pretty good chance she doesn't. Let's say she wins the primary. I think there's a decent chance she does win, just for this reason, that it's gonna be a more Democratic year probably than
Right.
it was in 2016. This time, that third party candidate is not running and is running for Senate, which actually could end up coming back to bite them, because they have 2 Senate races since they pushed Franken out. They have 2 Senate races on the ballot, and they have a third party. So that's a separate issue. So without the third party candidate with more energy, then you may just on a sheer numbers game put her over the top. But it goes back to the question of, well, what kind of party are you trying to become? Like you could have put Erdman, I'm sure, on that ballot line as well, and he could have won on, he supports Medicare for all, he supports the whole kind of the Bernie list of policies. So you're going to send a Democrat to Congress from that district probably this cycle, but the party's choosing the medical device executive who, just a couple years ago was directing a corporate PAC that was funding Republicans, actually.